An analysis of sex work. Section. The only real freedom in prostitution is the freedom for bourgeois men to access the bodies of proletarian women. As Michael Parenti stated in Dirty Truths, quote, "There is no such thing as a freedom detached from the socio-economic reality in which it might find a place." End quote. As you note, we are, quote, "complex human beings making difficult decisions under the constraints of poverty and many other intersecting forms of marginalization." End quote. Yet in the next sentence, you state that people, quote, "choose to work in the sex industry." As you noted above, constraints are necessarily coercive. The definition of a constraint is a, quote, "limitation or restriction." End quote. The very act of constraining someone is to restrain their freedom to move. The definition of, quote, "constraining" is to, quote, "compel or force someone to follow a particular course of action." End quote. Consent does not exist in a vacuum, sealed off from the other conditions of society. To decontextualize consent from the broader structures of the economy and society, which both create the options we are able to choose from and apply pressure for us to choose certain options over others, is to only understand consent in its most superficial meaning. You correctly note that low-wage work is not enough to pay the enormous debt that comes from being an immigrant or a working-class person in the United States. Yet after naming the coercive conditions of capitalism, you say that, quote, "most people are not doing this work against their will, any more than other types of immigrant work." End quote. This is erroneous on two grounds. Firstly, by naming that people enter the sex trade because all other options of sustaining their lives are exhausted, the, quote, "other types of immigrant work." You are necessarily saying that they are pressured by the dreadful conditions of capitalism to enter the sex trade as the only option they have left to adequately provide for themselves. This downplays the conditions of wage slavery and the reactionary ideologies within capitalism: racism, sexism, ableism, xenophobia, etc., which cut people out from participation in the formal economy. Those two factors make, quote, "choice" impossible. Secondly, you ignore the very real data that the majority of prostituted people are between the ages of 13 and 25, and of that, an overwhelming majority of prostitutes are forced either physically or through coercive economic conditions. Russian revolutionary feminist Nadezhda Krupskaya, speaking on the conditions of prostituted women in 1899, in The Woman Worker, still holds true today. Beginning of long quote. One has only to listen to how the well-fed bourgeois and his wife talk with contempt of the depraved factory women and girls, and with what hypocritical disgust these ladies who have never known poverty pronounce the word, quote, "prostitute." Bourgeois professors shamelessly go into print to assert that prostitutes are not slaves, but are people who have chosen to take that road. It is the same hypocrisy that insists that no one prevents a worker from leaving a given factory where it is impossible to breathe, what with the dust, poisonous vapors, heat, and so on. They, quote, "voluntarily" remain working there for 16 to 18 hours a day. End of section.